Hello, welcome to Video1 in my electronic design fundamentals. These are basically a group of shorter, kind of more focused videos that cover the topics that we go through in class, but kind of summarized and broken down into more digestible bits where I'm kind of covering a core concept that we covered in class as well. It's just not a recording of the class, but hopefully a little more approachable and digestible. So the first video here is all about getting organized. File structure, managing your files, and just how important it is when you start to use your computer to do some real work when it comes to graphic design, and very specifically Adobe InDesign. Your file structure and keeping things organized and managed becomes really critical. So I'm going to go through my recommended way. Of course, everybody kind of has their own way of sort of organizing things, but I'm just going to cover some real basics in case you're really, really new to just using your computer for anything more than, email and social media or whatever, and actually getting to work and managing your files. So the first thing is that I recommend very strongly is that you got to understand the difference between your local hard drive that's built into your computer and external drives. We're all familiar that our computer has a hard drive in it that stores files, and a lot of times you got a lot of space, but if you're working on a laptop or even a desktop computer, that can be a little bit limiting. You don't want to have your files, your working files, limited to a local drive. You want to invest in an external drive. This is so that you can move between systems. If the computer fails, you won't have lost all of your work, but also, design work files can get quite large. So you don't want to overtax your local hard drive. You want to leave lots of space there. So you can get a two terabyte drive, like tons of space for cheap, relatively cheap. So it's really worth putting your money into. And I would also recommend getting 2 of whatever you decide on, because you want to be backing your work up. You really don't want to lose your work over time. So 2 terabytes is plenty, but it adds up. Your average InDesign project, 1 or 2 gigabytes by the time it's done. You do enough of them, you have quite a bit of files on store, so you don't want to lose them. So keeping your stuff off your desktop on an external drive is tip number 1. But beyond that, how do you organize your files so that you don't lose projects? This is the most common thing that I see happening with students and new designers or whatever, is they get confused as to what the latest version of their file is, or they just straight up lose a file that they worked on and end up having to do things all over again. None of us have time for that. And it comes down to basic file management, organizing your files. So what I've done here is I've set up just a fresh kind of demo Gmail account, and I'm using that for a couple of things that I'll get into. And I'm just showing you an empty folder, my external drive, just a files folder. So how do I organize stuff? Well, the first thing I do is I make a top level folder that is sort of a grouping, like a client name, or in this particular case, VCAD, right? So I'm going to just make myself a new folder, VCAD. And now I'm going to want to go in and kind of group and organize things within VCAD, right? Different classes or projects that I'm assigned in. You guys will have different classes or projects. I would recommend going in and making a subfolder that is just something basic. We're going to call this Electronic Design 1. Okay, so new folder, Electronic Design Level 1. Now there's project codes that VCAD gives us. We could use those, but let's assume we're doing something a little more generic. I'm just going to group stuff into Electronic Design 1. Now, as you go into projects, what you kind of want is you want a way to be able to quickly search and reference things as you come back to them. So we can sort of make stuff up as we go, which I see a lot of people doing, but it is better to have some sort of a predetermined structure that brings some searchability to your files, especially as you build up files over time. You're going to start to have a lot of projects. And what we want is we want to have a quick and easy way to develop a unique lookup code for any particular project, right? So I'm just going to use something like electronic design and then semester time as a way to define a project. And then there's going to be sub-projects within your projects or whatever. But, electronic design 1 might not be enough if we're searching it. But there's going to be other things that we're going to get into. But I'm going to quickly show you guys what I like to do to name my projects so that each of them has their own unique code that I can quickly search for. And this is important because when we're working in design these days, most of the time we're working on our local machine, but then we're sharing it either with print shops or clients or what have you online. And Google Drive is probably the most commonly used, most flexible and useful one across pretty much every application that I can think of. There's tons of other ones, but this is sort of a generic system that works anywhere. But whatever we're doing with our local files on our local hard drive or our project drive, we are going to also have a version of some of our files uploaded to a sharing platform like Google Drive. So when you go into Google Drive out of the gate, you know, if you just go to drive.google.com and you've never used it before, you know, your drive is going to be kind of empty. I just created something here purely for this demo, which I'll show. But also people can share stuff with you. So I've shared Electronic Design 1, the folder that I've all shared with you guys in class. I've shared it with this demo account, right? So I can add a shortcut to this folder to my drive, which I'm going to do. So when I go to my drive, I've got a shortcut now for GCAD. And then I can organize this however I want. I might call the folder here called VCAD. And I'll put that right in there. Okay. So I want to now come up with a way that as my projects go, instead of just calling them assignment 1 or 2 or whatever, that might not be unique enough, especially if I'm going to do this project multiple times over multiple semesters. I want a way to track and find something based on a unique project code. And I do this for all my projects. So how do I do it? I come up with a spreadsheet that is basically, you can create a spreadsheet on Google Drive, just called a new Google Sheet like this, blank spreadsheet, there you go. You can then just kind of break it down to 3 straightforward things. A client code, which is sort of alphabetical, so this helps me remember what it is. So it's typically a 3 or 4 letter code. So for VCAD, for example, it would be VCAD. And then a number. Now you could just generate a sequence of numbers that starts at 1, but the problem with that is that from a search perspective, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those are going to be really quite common. You want something that's not going to show up in a whole bunch of documents, because this project code, you know, you're going to combine it with VCAD and the number, so just a basic number would work. But I tend to just make it like you're going to want enough that you're never going to run out. So let's call it, it's a 10-digit number, so let's just go 10,000. So that's really my, what's that? That's 100,000, 10,000. So that's my first one, and then my next project is 10,001. So this is just going to, I seem to like keep it in an extra 0. So this is just going to be your sequence. So then you can just select these, and then if you hold down Shift and then click, and just drag down, it's going to, whoops. Oh, I got to put in 1001, don't I? Hold down Shift, click, and it's just going to go auto count up. And, you know, depends on how many projects you're going to go through, but you can always add more. But that's 156. So that now has given us a unique project code. Okay. So then my first VCAD project for this set would be, you know, I'll type in a description for it. So we'll call it assignment 1 magazine design. Okay. So my spreadsheet now has assigned a couple of things that I can start using as a way to organize stuff between my email, my Google Drive, and my local hard drive that is searchable, right? So what I do is I select these 3, just copy that. That becomes your project folder, you know. So then I would make myself my own folder within this thing. I'm the owner of it. New folder, and I'm going to name it with that code. It puts tabs in there, so you can just delete those. So you create that. So that is now your Google Drive equivalent. Now my local drive, I want to do the same thing in my files. So I want to make a new folder. And I want to name it the same thing, VCAD 10,000 Assignment 1 magazine. You know, it seems easy when you've just got one, But when you have been working for a long time, you're going to end up with files that look more like this, where you've got all of these different clients, and then over the time you end up doing a lot of projects for certain clients. So let's go into somebody who's really busy, you know, years and years and years of files here. I want to be able to quickly search and look those up. So naming things this way gives a unique code combined with the alphanumeric description plus the number. You're going to be able to find this on Google Drive or on your local hard drive really quick and easily. So it's just a really good way to start to just get your main file structure organized so that whatever's on Google Drive is going to match whatever's on your local drive, and you're going to be able to keep it really, really straight that way. So let's go back to my shortcut on my files example. So after I've set up my project, call that a docket or a project numbering system. Now we're going to go through and say, well, how do we kind of keep our files straight in terms of what we're doing? And basically, most of the time I've found there's kind of three types of files generally that we have that we care about that we need to store. So that's files where we're coming up with ideas, coming up with new design concepts or whatever. Then there's the stuff that's finished that we want to hand in or send out to print or publication or whatever. It's finished. And then there's stuff that people have given us, like files that are supplied, photographs, illustrations, or whatever that people give us on our project. So I like to organize my files that way. So the first one is concept development. And then I call another folder source. So that's basically once something's gone out to print or is kind of, I'm done with it, I make a copy of everything to source, and I don't touch those files afterwards. And then supplied content. Within each of these folders, you can kind of organize things however you want, but this is the part that I think of as the shared structure, that when I want to share something with collaborators online on class up on Google Drive, I'm going to make the same folder structure. I'm going to make a folder called concept development and, source. I don't really need to do that at the beginning, but most of the time it's just a difference so that if someone is a collaborator on this project with me, they can know what the finished files are. So that's it. That's just keeping that basic structure in place. The next thing we will care about then is file types and organizing ourselves in terms of what the latest version of our file is. We've probably all found ourselves in the situation where we're happily going along and we make ourselves a new InDesign file and we make changes to it, but we don't necessarily want to override the previous version. We're like, hey, I kind of want to keep that older version, right? So let's say I'm doing something like a logo concept. Okay, so I'm just going to bring up an Adobe Illustrator file here. So say I'm just working on this. So I'm kind of happy with this logo, so I'm going to save it as into my files project there. It's a concept, but I'm just going to call it BSF Annual Report Logo. But I'm not sure, it hasn't been approved yet. Maybe they want to do something different. So I'm going to say, I'm just going to call it draft. And then, I've saved it and I'm working with it. Client comes along and says, you know what, I'd like it if you changed this to the blue instead of the red. Okay, there you go. Blue logo. So I might just save over the file, but maybe that's not the right blue or whatever. It's a revision. It's not final, it's just a revision. So it's no longer a draft. Now it's BSF Annual Report Logo. I forgot to include the logo. I try and be descriptive. Rev 1. Okay. And then they come along and say, no, we didn't mean that blue. We meant a different blue. Okay, what's that blue? Well, make a new swatch or whatever. And then they change their mind again and say, no, actually we meant all red. Okay, fine. So now I'm going to save this as Rev 2. Okay. Now why do I do this? Why don't I just call it blue or red or whatever? Because when I'm sharing it with other people, when I upload these files to Google Drive from my local storage, okay, you don't necessarily know what the most final version is. You don't know that they asked for red after blue or whatever. So if you're trying to synchronize what you're doing, if you're part of a team, that can be kind of confusing. And you can't really necessarily look at the time either, because that's just local, but it'll change based on when I upload it to Google Drive. So when I put this folder up there, if you see multiple versions of any type of file, you always know that whatever the highest revision number, that's the most recent one. And if you do this with yourself, if you get in the habit of naming your files as you make changes this way, you will always naturally make sure you're working on the latest version of a file. This becomes really important if you come back to a project months or even years later. It can be very difficult to remember, well, what was the last version of an ad or whatever. But if you use the revision naming system, it's always going to help you know what is the most recent version. It's also going to help you know what you can safely delete. If I go through a project and maybe I make 10 or 20 revisions over the course of the project with people giving me feedback, I don't want to keep all 20 copies. I just want to have maybe the last couple. So then I can just go and delete my latest revs. So using this Rev1, Rev2, it's nice and simple. It's nice and easy. You're not naming something final, because we've all done it where we're like, well, we thought that was final, but now this one's final. And no, I mean it. This one's now the final. It becomes a bit of a mess. But if you just name things through revisions, you're never going to end up in that situation. So that would be just a file naming convention that you kind of stick with. Just spell it out. Put Rev2, Rev1, Rev3, Rev 50, whatever, until you're done, and then you can delete all your old stuff and just keep what's up to date. I always like to keep a couple of revisions in case I ever have to go back and sort of see the history of a project. Typically, it's daily progress. Whatever I save, that's what it is. So you just keep your revisions tracked that way. The only other remaining thing is making sure that you're aware of your file extensions. This becomes pretty important with Adobe InDesign, because there are actually a few different file extensions that behave differently in Adobe InDesign. So let's go over to Adobe InDesign now. I'm going to quickly go through the 3 basic file types that we're working with in Adobe InDesign. So when we go new document, our default is an INDD file. So that is a standalone layout. Let's do something real basic, 8.5 by 11. Okay, for some reason my Adobe InDesign is very picky with this second field. I'm not going to bother setting it up. It's just about file type. And that's got a crazy margin on it, but whatever. So we're going to do save. Going to save it to this files project sample that I'm working on. Okay, concept dev, sample, document, draft. Okay, so INDD, InDesign document, that is the default. But if you click here, you can see that there's some options. So an InDesign template, INDT, or InDesign CS4 or later IDML. We don't use this very often, but on rare occasions, you might work with a print shop that's super hopelessly out of date, doesn't have InDesign Creative Cloud. You can save backwards to backwards compatible format, but pretty rare. But these two are pretty common. Those are the 2 types that you're using pretty regularly. The only difference between an InDesign document and an InDesign template is that when you open up an InDesign document, so I saved it as this, okay, I'm done. I'm just going to go and delete that. Close it, I mean. The only difference is when I double click this and open my InDesign file, it opens it, and when I hit save, it overwrites whatever is there, unless I do a save as. However, if I save this as a template, let's say I called this a template, sample document template. So back on my local hard drive, now you see this INDT file, okay? And I don't think I've assigned it Adobe InDesign by default, but if I open it with Adobe InDesign, now it's untitled, so when I hit save, it's not going to override the format. That is literally the only difference between an INDD file and an INDT file. But if you're going to make a template that you're going to use over and over again, it's pretty important to make sure that you know the difference and that the extension shows you what it is. So there is a third type of document that we create in Adobe InDesign, and that is an INDB file. So create a new book. Now, what is a book? A book is just a collection. It's just a document that links a bunch of documents together. But it does a little more than that in terms of auto-numbering your pages, helping you build automatic table of contents, and doing all of your pagination for you. So any sort of a project that's got more than a couple of pages, I would recommend setting up an InDesign book for it and then linking it all together. I also use books for things like collections of business cards, advertisements, whatever. Anything that's going to share kind of common elements, linking them all together in an INDB book file is just a handy shortcut. So I'm just going to call this sample book. But all you get in Adobe InDesign when you do that is this folder that just looks like this, sample book. It doesn't really have anything in it. It's just an empty directory listing, but you can then add InDesign files to it. So you can see there's a big textile catalog. That was the last book I was working on. All these InDesign files are all linked to that book file. But I'm just going to go and use our sample. And I'm going to link my typoed SAMP document draft InDesign file. Okay, so that just tells me page 1 to 4. And then for my template, let's just do this as section 2. Okay, now I'm going to add section 2 to my book. So it keeps track of the pages independently. And I can now quickly go back and forth between my different InDesign section layouts without having to drop down to the operating system to open up the file. Because one of the things that you'll discover in Adobe InDesign is kind of annoying is that it doesn't tend to really remember what folder you've been working in. It constantly goes back to whatever your latest past location file was. So you feel like you're drilling through your OS structure quite regularly. This is a nice shortcut to it. You keep your book open, you can navigate quickly around, close things. You just open up your book, and wherever all your linked InDesign files are within your file structure, it's just going to take you right to it. So that can be hugely, hugely useful. So using a book, I use it all the time for anything that's got multiple files associated with it. So that would be your next key thing. So after that, in our concept development folder, you could, like I said, you can kind of organize this however you want. And, what we're looking at here is logos and things. It really depends on the complexity of the project. I typically like to organize my stuff based on what sort of section it goes in. So that's just going to kind of grow as you work on your file. But at the very basics, you might want to do something like new folder, photos, like raw photos or whatever, although that's typically what a supplied content folder is. Somebody's going to give you a bunch of pictures, so you're going to keep them there, do some Photoshop work, save them in concept development under photos or whatever. Logos, Adobe Illustrator illustrations, whatever kind of makes sense for your project. You probably want to kind of keep this concept development folder relatively clean, however you like, but that's up to you. From here, this is sort of your own workspace, but we're not too worried about. We just want to keep it, this is my concept work that's in progress, and I've got my revisions and things. Once I think I'm finished, I'm going to make a version of my file set in source that I'm going to kind of leave alone, that I know that it's gone out for print or whatever. I'm not going to mess with it because I want it to match, right? So that's where you keep your more recent revisions of your files. So that's kind of my quick and dirty, keep your files organized. If you use a naming system like that on Google Drive, you're going to have a better time of it for sure, because you're not going to be able to lose your projects. You've got your codes that you can look up, and everything kind of goes more smoothly from there. So in the next video, what am I going to talk about in the next video? Let me go back to my list. I've lost my file here. So in my next video, I'm going to dive into the very basics of Adobe InDesign, which is pretty much going to be the core of electronic design 1 and 2. We're going to use Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop as well, but the main focus is really getting oriented with Adobe InDesign. So I'm going to break it down into short, kind of focused little tutorials that just cover a couple of the basics. So that will be video 2.